Look at Shizuku's reviews, bringing you a southern perspective on books, movies, music, and much, much more. Stick around for a while, you just might hear something wicked. And welcome, friends. This is episode number 22, and this is a Tuesday read. So, we shall hurriedly jump into Eothen, continuing with Chapter 4. The Tea Road, or the Trode. Methley recovered almost suddenly, and we determined to go through the Trode together. My comrade was a capital Grecian, and it is true that his singular mind so ordered and disposed his classic lore as to impress it with something of an original and barbarous character, with an almost Gothic quaintness, more properly beginning to a rich native ballad than to the poetry of Hellas. There was a certain impropriety in his knowing so much Greek and unfitness in the idea of marble fauns and satyrs, and even Olympian gods, lugged in under the oaken roof and the painted light of an odd old Norman hall. But Methley painted light of an odd old Norman hall. Oh, excuse me. But Methley, abounding in Homer, really loved him, as I believe, in all truth, without whim or fancy. Moreover, he had a good deal of the practical sagacity of a Yorkshireman hippodomoio, and this enabled him to apply his knowledge with much more tact than is usually shown by people so learned as he. I too loved Homer, but not with a scholar's love. The most humble and pious among women was yet so proud a mother that she could teach her firstborn son no Watts hymns, no collects for the day. She could teach him in the earliest childhood no less than this, to find a home in his saddle and to love old Homer and all that Homer sung. True it is that the Greek was ingeniously rendered into English, the English of Pope, but not even a mesh like that can screen an earnest child from the fire of Homer's battles. I pored over the Odyssey as over a storybook, hoping and fearing for the hero whom yet I partially scorned. But the Iliad, line by line, I clasped it to my brain with reverence as well as with love. As an old woman deeply trustful sits reading her Bible because of the old world to come, so, as though it would fit me for the coming strife of this temporal world, I read the Iliad. Even outwardly, it was not like the other books. It was throned in towering folios. There was a preface or dissertation printed in type still more majestic than the rest of the book. This I read, but not till my enthusiasm for the Iliad had already run high. The writer, compiling the opinions of many men, and chiefly of the ancients, set forth, I know not how quaintly, that the Iliad was all in all to the human race, that it was history, poetry, revelation, that the works of men's hands were folly and vanity, and would pass away like the dreams of a child, but that the kingdom of Homer would endure forever and ever. I assented with all my soul. I read, and I still read. I came to know Homer. A learned commentator knows something of the Greeks, in the same sense as an oil and color man may be said to know something of painting. But take an untamed child, and leave him alone for 12 months with any translation of Homer, and he will be nearer by 20 centuries to the spirit of old Greeks. He does not stop in the 9th year of the siege to admire this or that group of words. He has no books in his tent, but he shares in vital councils with the king of men, and knows the inmost souls of the impending gods. How profanely he exults over the powers divine when they are taught to dread the prowess of mortals, and most of how he rejoices when the god of war flies howling from the spear of Diomed and mounts into heaven for safety. Then the beautiful episode of the 6th book. The way to feel this is not to go casting about and learning from pastors and masters how best to admire it. The impatient child is not grubbing for beauties, but pushing the siege. The women vex him with their delays and their talking. The mention of the nurse is personal, and little sympathy has he for the child that is young enough to be frightened at the nodding plume of a helmet. But all the while that he thus chafes at the pausing of the action, the strong vertical light of Homer's poetry is blazing so full upon the people and things of the Iliad, that soon to the eyes of the child they grow familiar as his mother's shawl. Yet of this great gain he is unconscious, and on he goes, vengefully thirsting for the best blood of Troy, and never remitting his fierceness, till almost suddenly it is changed for sorrow, the new and generous sorrow that he learns to feel when the noblest of all his foes lies sadly dying at the Scaean gate. Heroic days are these, but the dark ages of schoolboy life come closing over them. I suppose it's all right in the end, yet at the first sight it does seem a sad intellectual fall from your mother's dressing room to a buzzing school. You feel so keenly the delights of early knowledge. You form strange mystic friendships with mere names of mountains and seas and continents and mighty rivers. You learn the ways of planets and transcend their narrow limits and ask for the end of space. You vex the electric cylinder till it yields you for your toy to play with, that subtle fire in which our earth was forged. You know of the nations that have towered high in the world, and the lives of the men who have saved whole empires from oblivion. What more will you ever learn? Yet the dismal change is ordained, and then thin, meager Latin, the same for everybody, with small shreds and patches of Greek, is thrown like a pauper's pall over all of your early lore, instead of sweet knowledge, vile, monkish, doggerel grammars and graduses, dictionaries and lexicons and horrible odds and ends of dead languages are given you for your portion, and down you fall from Roman story to a 3-inch scrap of Scriptors Romani, from Greek poetry down to the cold rations of Porte Grace, cut up by commentators and served out by schoolmasters. It was not the recollection of school nor college learning, but the rapturous and earnest reading of my childhood which made me bend forward so longingly to the plains of Troy. Away from our people and our horses, Methley and I went loitering along by the willowy banks of a stream that crept in quietness through the low, even plain. There was no stir of weather overhead, no sound of rural labor, no sign of life in the land. But all the earth was dead and still, as though it had lain for thrice 1,000 years under the leaden gloom of one unbroken Sabbath. Softly and sadly the poor, dumb, patient stream went winding and winding along. Through its shifting pathway, in some places its waters were parted, and then again lower down, and they would meet once more. And I could see that the stream from year to year was finding itself new channels, and flowed no longer in its ancient track. But I knew from that the springs which fed it were high on Ida, the springs of Simois, and Scamander. It was coldly and thanklessly and with vacant, unsatisfied eyes that I watched the slow coming and the gliding away of the waters. I tell myself now, as a profane fact, that I did indeed stand by that river. Methley gathered some seeds from the bushes that grew there, but since I am away from his banks, divine Scamander has recovered the proper mystery belonging to him as an unseen duty, a kind of indistinctness, like that which belongs to far antiquity, has spread itself over my memory of the winding stream that I saw with these very eyes. One's mind regains in absence that dominion over earthly things which has been shaken by their rude contact. You force yourself heartily into the material presence of a mountain or a river whose name belongs to poetry and ancient region, rather than to the external world. Your feelings, wound up and kept ready for some sort of half-expected rapture, are chilled and borne down for the time under all this load of real earth and water. But let these once pass out of sight, and then again the old fanciful notions are restored, and the mere realities which you have just been looking at are thrown back so far into distance that the very event of your intrusion upon such scenes begins to look dim and uncertain, as though it belonged to mythology. It is not over the plain before Troy that the river now flows. Its waters have edged away far towards the north, since the day that divine Scamander, whom the gods call Xanthus, went down to battle for Ilion with Mars and Phoebus and Latona and Diana glorying in her arrows and Venus the lover of smiles. And now, when I was vexed at the migration of Scamander and the total loss or absorption of the poor dear Simois, how happily Methley reminded me that Homer himself had warned us of some such changes. The besiegers in the beginning their wall had neglected the hecatombs, tombs, due to the gods. And so after the fall of Troy, Apollo turned the paths of the rivers that flow from Ida and sent them flooding over the wall till all the beach was smooth and free from the unhallowed works of the Greeks. It is true, I see now, on looking to the passage, that Neptune, when the work of destruction was done, turned back the rivers to their ancient ways. But their old channels passing through that light, pervious soil would have been lost in the 9 days' flood, and perhaps the God, when he willed to bring back the rivers to their ancient beds, may have done his work, but ill. It is easier, they say, to destroy than it is to restore. We took our horses again and went southward towards the very plain between Troy and the tents of the Greeks. But we rode by a line at some distance from the shore. Whether it was that the lay of the ground hindered my view towards the sea, or that I was all intent upon Ida, or whether my mind was in vacancy, or whether, as is most like, I had strayed from the Dardan plains, all back to gentle England. There is now no knowing, nor caring, but it was not quite suddenly, indeed, but rather, as it were, in the swelling and falling of a single wave, that the reality of that very sea view, which had bounded the sight of the Greeks, now visibly acceded to me, and rolled full upon my brain. Conceive how deeply that eternal coastline, that fixed horizon, those island rocks, must have graven their images upon the minds of the Grecian warriors by the time that they had reached the 9th year of the siege. Conceive the strength and the fanciful beauty of the speeches with which a whole army of imagining men must have told their weariness, and how the sauntering chiefs must have whelmed that daily scene, what must have whelmed that daily scene with their deep Ionian curses. And now it was that my eyes were greeted with a delightful surprise. Whilst we were at Constantinople, Methley and I had pored over the map together. We agreed that whatever may have been the exact site of Troy, the Grecian camp must have been nearly opposite to the space betwixt the islands of Imbros and Tenedros. But Methley reminded me on a passage in the Iliad, in which Neptune is represented as looking at the scene of action before Ilion from above the island of Samothrace. Now, Samothrace, according to the map, appeared to be not only out of all seeing distance from the Troad, but to be entirely shut out from it by intervening Imbros, a larger island which stretches its length right athwart the line of sight from Samothrace to Troy, piously allowing that the dread of Comotor of our globe might have seen all mortal doings, even from the depths of his own cerulean kingdom. I still felt that if a station were to be chosen from which to see the fight, old Homer, so material in his ways of thought, so averse from all haziness and overreaching, would have meant to give the god for his station some spot within reach of man's eye from the plains of Troy. I think that this testing of the poet's words by map and compass may have shaken a little of my faith in the completeness of his knowledge. Well, now I had come. There to the south was Tenedos, and here at my side was Imbros, all right. And according to the map, but aloft over Imbros, aloft in a faraway heaven, was Samothrace, the watchtower of Neptune. So Homer had appointed it, and so it was. The map was correct enough, but could not, like Homer, convey the whole truth. Thus, vain and false are mere human surmises and doubts, which clash with Homeric writ. Nobody whose mind had not been reduced to the most deplorably logical condition could look upon this beautiful congruity betwixt the Iliad and the material world, and yet bear to suppose that the poet may have learned the features of the coast from mere hearsay. Now then, I believed. Now I knew that Homer had passed along here, that this vision of Samothrace overtowering the nearer island was common to him and to me. After a journey of some few days by the route of Adramyttium and Pergamo, we reached Smyrna. The letters which Methley had received obliged him to return to England. So that was really interesting that he gives an outlook on his musings of his childhood and everything. And I have also read the Iliad, and yes, I understand how he's relating that, the action of the Iliad, and you just want the action to keep going, and you get aggravated when other characters stop the action, and you just want to keep going. So, with that, I'm going to take a short break, and I shall be right back. Catch you on the next side. And welcome back. I hope you were able to get everything that you needed from your break. And this week I am going to skip one of the tales from A Book of Brave Deeds, and I'm going to go ahead and continue straight through to H.G. Wells' The Outline of History. And last time we left off, come on. Last time we left off at 2, the records of the rocks. And it's split into 2 sections. The first being the first living things, and the second, natural selection and the changes of species. 1. We do not know certainly of how life began upon the earth. Biologists have made many guesses and suggestions, and there seems to be a general agreement that life began in warm, sunlit, shallow water, possibly in pools and lagoons along the coasts of the first formed seas. It began perhaps as a slime, as a sort of sublife that slowly and imperceptibly took on the distinctive qualities of life. Upon no part of earth at present are there the sort of conditions, chemical and physical, under which life can conceivably had begun. There is certainly no fresh beginning of life going on now, but out of ignorance, but out of inorganic matter, it is possible to make slimes and films that faintly parody the structure and even the spreading and growth of living things. If the beginning of life was a natural, unmiraculous process, then surely some day it will be possible for the man of science to imitate and repeat it. Until that can be done, this question necessarily remains to a certain extent speculative. And if many biologists are convinced that life appeared under the requisite conditions, I'm sorry, I lost my place. My eyes started jumping there. Oh. And if many biologists are convinced that life appeared under the requisite conditions as naturally and inevitably as ice appears when water under the normal pressure is cooled below the freezing point, it is also the case that many other people of equal intelligence are of an opposite opinion. Here we cannot be expected to adjudicate upon the question. The idea that life appeared on the earth as a natural and unnecessary chemical and physical process without the intervention of any miraculous factor seems to be very repugnant to many religious minds, but that repugnance is due perhaps rather to a confusion of thought in these minds than to any essential irregularity in the conception itself. They think of life as being in a way already soul, as they ascribe all sorts of moral qualities to it. They side with it against dead matter, but it is difficult to see why a slug or a toadstool, a louse, or a cankerous parasitic growth upon the bark of a tree should be treated as though it and the processes of its existence were in some mysterious way higher than, for example, the beautifully marshaled elements in a crystalline group, or in a gem, or in a slab of patterned marble, or the lovely patterning of rippled water in the sunlight, or the undulations of wind-blown sand. Why should the maker of the universe take sides between almost inanimate and altogether inanimate? The atmosphere was much denser in the days of life's beginning. Usually great cloud masses obscured the sun. Frequent storms darkened the heavens. The land of those days, upheaved by violent volcanic forces, was a barren land, without vegetation, without soil. Almost incessant rainstorms swept down upon it, and rivers and torrents carried great loads of sediment out to sea to become muds that hardened later into slats and shales and sands that became sandstones. The geologists have studied the whole accumulation of these sediments as it remains today, from those of the earliest ages to the most recent. Of course, the oldest deposits are the most distorted and changed and worn, and in them there is now no certain trace to be found of life at all. Probably the earliest forms of life were small and soft, leaving no evidence of their existence behind them. It was only when some of these living things developed skeletons and shells of lime and such like hard materials that they left fossil vestiges after they died, and so put themselves on record for examination. The literature of geology is very largely an account of the fossils that are found in the rocks, and the order in which layers after layers of rocks lie on one another. The very oldest rocks must have been formed before there was any sea at all, when the earth was too hot for a sea to exist, and when the water that is now sea was an atmosphere of steam mixed with the air. The higher levels of the atmosphere were dense with clouds, from which a hot rain fell towards the rocks below, to be converted again into steam long before it reached their incandescence. Below this steam atmosphere, the molten world stuff solidified as the first rocks. These first rocks must have solidified as a cake growing over liquid material beneath, much as cooling lava does. They must have appeared first as crusts and clinkers. They must have been constantly remelted and recrystallized before any thickness of them became permanently solid. The scenery of the world in those days must have been more like the interior of an electric furnace than anything else to be found upon earth at the present time. After long ages, the steam in the atmosphere began also to condense and to fall right down to earth, pouring at last over these warm primordial rocks in rivulets of hot water and gathering in depressions as pools and lakes in the first seas. And to those seas, the streams that poured over the rocks brought with them dust and particles to form a sediment. And this sediment accumulated in layers, or as geologists call them, strata, and formed the first sedimentary rocks. Those earliest sedimentary rocks sank into depressions and were covered by others. They were bent, tilted up, and torn by great volcanic disturbances and by tidal strains that swept through the rocky crust of the earth. We find these first sedimentary rocks still coming to the surface of the land here and there, either not covered by later strata or exposed after vast ages of concealment by the wearing off of the rock that covered them later. There are great surfaces of them in Canada especially. They are cleft and bent, partially remelted, recrystallized, hardened, and compressed. but recognizable for what they are, and they contain no single certain trace of life at all. They are frequently called azoic, lifeless rocks, but since in some of these earliest sedimentary rocks, a substance called graphite, black lead, occurs, and also red and black oxide of iron, and since it is asserted that these substances need the activity of living things for their production, which may or may not be the case, some geologists prefer to call these earliest sedimentary rocks Archaeozoic, primordial life. They suppose that the first life was soft living matter and had no shells or skeletons or any such structure that could remain as a recognizable fossil after its death, and that its chemical influence caused the deposition of graphite and iron oxide. This is pure guessing, of course, and there is at least an equal probability that in the time of formation of the azoic rocks life had not yet begun. Overlying or overlapping these azoic or archaeozoic rocks come others, manifestly also very ancient and worn, which do contain traces of life. These first remains are of the simplest description. They are the vestiges of simple plants called algae, or marks like the tracks made by worms in the sea mud. There are also the skeletons of the microscopic creatures called radiolaria. This second series of rocks is called Proterozoic, beginning of life series, and marks a long age in the world's history. Lying over and above the Proterozoic rocks is a third series, which is found to contain a considerable number and variety of traces of living things. First comes the evidence of a diversity of shellfish, crabs, and such like crawling things, worms, seaweeds, and the like. Then of a multitude of fishes, and the beginnings of land plants and land creatures. These rocks are called Paleozoic, ancient life rocks. They mark a vast era during which life was slowly spreading, increasing, and developing in the seas of our world. Through long ages, through the earliest Paleozoic time, it was no more than a proliferation of such swimming and creeping things in the water. There were creatures called trilobite. These were crawling things like big sea woodlice, and they were probably related to the American king crab of today. There were also sea scorpions, the prefects of that early world. The individuals of certain species of these were 9 feet long. These were the very highest sorts of life. There were abundant different sorts of an order of shellfish called brachiopods. There were plant animals, rooted and joined together like plants, and loose weeds that waved in the waters. It was not a display of life to excite our imaginations. There was nothing that ran or flew or even swam swiftly or skillfully, except for the size of some of the creatures. It was not very different from, and rather less various than, the kind of life a student would gather from any summertime ditch nowadays for microscopical examination. Such was the life of the shallow seas through a couple of 100 million years in the early Paleozoic period. The land during that time was apparently absolutely barren. We find no trace nor hint of land life. Everything that lived in those days lived underwater for most of all of its life, for ages that stagger the imagination. That was all that there was of life, and before that time, the earth had begun hot and lifeless for hundreds of millions of years. Between the formation of these lower Paleozoic rocks, in which the sea scorpion and trilobite ruled, in our own time, there have intervened almost immeasurable ages represented by layers and masses of sedimentary rocks. There are first the upper Paleozoic rocks, and above the geologists distinguish two great divisions. Next, above the Paleozoic, come the Mesozoic, middle life rocks. This a second vast system of fossil-bearing rocks, representing perhaps 150 million years of swift years, and containing a wonderful array of fossil remains, bones of giant reptiles, and the like, which we will presently describe. And above these again, the Cenozoic, recent life rocks, a mere 50 million years in length, but a third great volume in the history of life, an unfinished volume of which the sand and mud that were carried out to sea yesterday by the rivers of the world to bury the bones and scales and bodies and tracks that will become at last fossils, the things of today, constitute the last written leaf. The markings and fossils in the rocks and the rocks themselves are the first historical documents. The history of life that men have puzzled out and are still puzzling out from them is called the record of the rocks. But when we call these rocks and the fossils a record in a history, it must not be supposed that there is any sign of an orderly keeping of a record. It is merely that whatever happens leaves some trace, if only we are intelligent enough to detect the meaning of that trace. Nor are the rocks of the world in orderly layers, one above the other, convenient for men to read. They are not like the books and pages of a library. They are torn, disrupted, interrupted, flung about, defaced, like a carelessly arranged office after it has experienced in succession a bombardment, a hostile military occupation, looting, an earthquake, riots, and a fire. And so, it is for countless generations this record of the rocks lay unsuspected beneath the feet of men. Fossils were known to the Ionian Greeks in the 6th century BC. They were discussed at Alexandria by Eratosthenes and others in the 3rd century BC, a discussion which is summarized in Strabo's Geography, 20 to 10 BC. They were known to the Latin poet Ovid, but he did not understand their nature. He thought they were the first rude efforts of creative power. They were noted by Arabic writers in the 10th century. Leonardo da Vinci, who lived so recently as the opening of the 16th century, 1452 to 1519, was one of the first Europeans to grasp the real significance of fossils. And as we have said, it has only been within the last century and a half that man has begun the serious and sustained deciphering of these long neglected early pages of the world's history. That's a lot to chew on. So, I'm going to take a short break after this, and I will let you chew over that. And we will be back on the other side with a little bit of American literature. Catch you on the other side. And welcome back. So, continuing on with our American history or American literature lesson this time, we will be covering Bartolome de la Casa from 1474 to 1566. Early modern Europe's most eloquent apologist for Native American rights, Bartolome de las Casas, first heard of the new discoveries as a student in Seville in 1493, when Columbus triumphantly entered that Spanish city. All his life, Casas recalled how Columbus brought with him 7 Indians who had survived the voyage, and beautiful green parrots, masks made of precious stones and fishbone, sizable samples of very fine gold, and many other things never before seen in Spain. Although Casas never called the seizure of those 7 Taino Indians on the island of Guanahani the first injustice committed in the Indies, in Spain of 1493, neither Casas nor anyone else had time to reflect on the moral implications of the pageant taking place before their eyes. Spain's enthusiastic reception of Columbus in 1493 helped recruit the large party of soldiers, settlers, clergy, and adventurers who joined his second voyage later that year, among whom was Casas's father, an impoverished merchant lured to the West Indies by the hope of new wealth. 9 years later, when Casas himself sailed to the Caribbean, his father, having returned home in the interim, sailed back with him. Both went in the company of Nicholas de Ovando, newly appointed to succeed Columbus as royal governor of the now chaotic island of Hispaniola. Casas was not immediately alarmed by conditions on Hispaniola, which resulted partly from rivalries among the Spanish. Columbus was a good commander, but a bad administrator, and the rumored riches of the West Indies attracted many opportunists, and partly from profound conflicts between the Europeans and Native Americans. The island, roughly the size of South Carolina, had a population of perhaps 1 million Taino Indians in 1492. Estimates range from about a tenth of this figure up to 8 million. These inhabitants lived in culturally interrelated subgroups in various regions of the island and had complex dealings with each other, both friendly and otherwise, before the arrival of Columbus. Relations between the Tainos and the Spaniards soured as early as the winter of 1493, when a party of sailors left a small settlement named La Navidad, the Nativity, stole many women from a village, rousing the jealousy of the men there, who brutally murdered the settlers of La Navidad. From that point on, Spanish policy in regard to the island's inhabitants was a matter of force, direct or implied, and the population soon plummeted under the effects of war, enslavement, and disease. Casas came to lament all three means of the natives' decline on Hispaniola and elsewhere in the West Indies, but was particularly concerned with the legality and morality of enslavement. Slavery hardly was invented in the Americas. Although once imported from the Old World, it gradually lost its quasi-feudal trappings and became a more absolute, crudely economic institution. The Spanish-American institution called the Repartimiento, and later the Encomienda, thus had deep roots on the other side of the ocean, but evolved to the west under the pressure of the political and economic circumstances. Repartimiento applied first in 1497 as part of an outline of Columbus's powers by the Crown to the distribution of land grants to settlers in the West Indies as a means of encouraging immigration. But as Columbus was forced to negotiate for peace with the Spanish rebel Francisco Roldan on Hispaniola in the late 1490s, he applied this term to a new distribution of whole Taino Indian communities as a source of labor to Roldan's allies, who would lay down their arms only if such awards were made to them. The land that the Spanish claimed, though, through conquest, would now be worked by the peoples who had been deprived of it in the first place. Casas knew this history well, because in his early years in America he had supported and benefited from these very institutions. The year after arriving on Hispaniola, he joined in a brutal attack on the Taino inhabitants of the province of Higüey on the island's eastern end, an attack the Spaniards claimed was in response to a Taino rebellion. As a member of this expedition, Casas saw cruelties on every hand. It was a general rule among the Spaniards to be cruel, not just cruel, but extraordinarily cruel, so that harsh and bitter treatment would prevent Indians from daring to think of themselves as human beings. But Casas himself received an encomienda of Native Americans for helping to hunt down the rebels during the Higüey campaign. Later, even after he had joined the priesthood, he received other grants for his part in the conquest of Cuba. In his history of the Indies, he wrote of his mortal blindness during this period, noting that he went about his concerns like the others, sending his share of the Indians to work fields and gold mines, taking advantage of them as much as he could. Only in 1514 did Casas enter on his long, gradually intensifying crusade for the dignity and right of the native peoples. In June of that year, he was prepared to preach during Pentecost to a Spanish congregation in a town near his estate. One biblical text from the apocryphal book of Ecclesiastes gripped his imagination. Bread is life to the destitute, and it is murder to deprive them of it. To rob your neighbor of his livelihood is to kill him, and the man who cheats a worker of his wages sheds blood. Contemplating this text, Casas knew he could not keep owning his fellow human beings. He relinquished his slaves secretly to Governor Velazquez. Then, on the Feast of Assumption, August 15th, announced from the pulpit that he had done so, and that all masters should do so, because holding Native Americans as slaves was a sin. In 1515, Casas took the case to Spain, where the government appointed him protector of the Indians and gave him permission to undertake a peaceful exemplary colonization on the Venezuelan coast. That venture failed, however, when Spaniards already residing there refused to give up their lucrative slave hunting raids. Their refusal, in turn, brought the wrath of the Cumana Indians down on the colonists. Casas himself escaped, but abashed, withdrew into Dominican monasteries on Hispaniola between 1522 and 1529. During those years, brutal new conquests in Guatemala, Nicaragua, and Peru buried the promise of his Venezuelan project ever deeper. Only in the 1530s, as Casas returned to political activity, traveling throughout Spain's American possessions, fighting new enslavements of the American Indians, and voyaging to Europe to lobby for change, and did his arguments have widespread effect. In 1537, Pope Paul III forbade all further enslavements. In 1542, Emperor Charles V followed suit in the new laws of the Indies, which gave Native Americans full protection of the courts, forbidding their enslavement on any grounds, and threatening confiscation for any encomendero who violated the new code. We order and command that henceforth, ran one clause, for no clause whatever, whether of war, rebellion, ransom, or in any other manner, can any Indian be made a slave. Such victories were bittersweet. As Bishop of Chiapas, Mexico, from 1544 to 1547, Casas sought to enforce the new laws, but riots were broad, and resistance throughout the Spanish colonies made it clear that his goals would not be easily achieved. Delusioned by Charles V's revocation that his goals would not be easily achieved, disillusioned by Charles V's revocation in the face of pressure from the settlers of the key features of the 1542 Code, Casas returned in 1547 to Spain, where he spent the last 20 years of his life writing about the long crusade in the West Indies. Angered and saddened by what he had witnessed of the Spanish conquest of America, Casas urged change by his own example, by public and private discourse, by influence at court and in the church, and by his writings. Of the latter, the most important in his era was the very brief relation of the devotion of the Indies, first published in 1552, but based on oral arguments used by Casas a decade earlier to persuade a special royal commission to frame the new code of 1542. The relation details with chilling effect the destruction visited on Native Americans by conquistadors and colonizers in pursuit of wealth beyond the reach of the authorities in Spain. In his own day, Casas was widely accused of treason and even endured charges of heresy, partly because the quick translation of his relation into several other languages provided Spain's enemies with ample evidence of the country's sins in America, a point the Protestant nations, such as the Netherlands and England, especially wished to make. Hold on. Ironically, the Protestant black legend of Spain's devastation of the West Indies roots itself in the polemical expose of the Catholic priest Bartolome de las Casas, an expose he intended a call to Spain's future reform rather than as a denunciation of its past. And that is it for today. I hope you enjoyed episode 22, and we shall revisit Bartolome de las Casas the next time with his letters. Thanks for listening. Have a good evening.